My son screamed that I was causing problems just seconds after his wife threw a glass of ice water in my face. The expensive restaurant fell silent as the cold liquid dripped onto my collar. I did not cry or beg for their forgiveness this time. I simply wiped my cheek, stood up, and dialed the one number I had saved for a moment, exactly like this. They thought I was broken, but I was finally ready to fight back. My name is Eleanor Ridgway, and at 62 years old, I had become an expert at making myself small so that others could feel big. We were seated at a corner table in the Copper Lantern, one of those dimly lit, overpriced restaurants in downtown Denver, where the waiters whispered and the menu had no prices. My son, Evan, and his wife, Madison, had insisted on this dinner. They said it was to discuss big business, specifically the image of the family within the new social circles they were desperately trying to infiltrate. Across from me sat Vivian Cross, Madison's mother, who looked at my pale blue cotton dress as if it were a stain on her silk tablecloth. It was my best dress, but in this room of tailored suits and diamond studs, I knew I looked like a relic from a life they wanted to forget. The conversation had been a minefield from the start, but the first real blow came from Vivian. She leaned in over her untouched appetizer, swirling her wine glass with a manicured hand. She commented to the table at large that there was a distinct scent that clung to people who had never known true wealth, a sort of desperate, stale odor that no amount of soap could wash away. Madison giggled behind her hand, finding her mother terribly witty. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a familiar burn of shame. I looked at Evan, waiting for him to defend me, to say that his mother smelled like hard work and sacrifice, not poverty. Instead, he just sighed, looked at his watch, and told me not to be so sensitive because everyone was just joking around. I tried to focus on my water glass, gripping it tightly to stop my hands from trembling. I did not want to ruin the night, but the anxiety in my chest was tightening like a vice. I cleared my throat and quietly mentioned that I had checked my bank account that morning. I asked Evan about the transfer he had promised would arrive 3 months ago. It was the money from my cashed-out retirement savings, the funds I had given them for the down payment on their house with the explicit promise of immediate repayment once their bonus checks cleared. The silence that followed was sharper than a steak knife. Madison slammed her fork down, the metal clattering against the fine china. Her perfectly painted lips curled into a sneer as she looked at me. She accused me of always ruining the mood with talk of money. She said I was obsessed with the past, and that I acted like a martyr just because I helped them out once. She claimed I did everything just to hold it over their heads, to make them feel guilty, and that my so-called sacrifice was nothing more than a manipulation tactic to keep them indebted to me. Before I could form a sentence to defend myself, before I could explain that I needed that money to pay my own heating bill, Madison reached for her glass. In one fluid motion, she threw the contents straight at me. The shock of the ice water hitting my face took my breath away. It dripped from my eyelashes, ran down my nose, and soaked the front of my cotton dress, turning the light blue fabric a dark, heavy navy. The restaurant went deadly quiet. I could hear the clinking of silverware stop at the nearby tables. I gasped, wiping my eyes, expecting Evan to check on me, to be horrified by his wife's behavior. Instead, Evan shot up from his chair, his face red with embarrassment, and screamed at me. He shouted that I was causing problems and that I always made a mess of everything. I sat there with water dripping down my neck, feeling the cold seep into my skin. I could feel the eyes of the waiters and the other diners burning into me, dissecting the wet, humiliation-soaked woman in the cheap dress. I felt small, like a scolded child in a room full of angry adults. But as the water slid down my collarbone, something else happened. A switch in the back of my mind, one that had been stuck in the off position for years, suddenly flicked on. The shame evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I picked up my linen napkin and calmly wiped my face. I did not scream. I did not cry. I stood up very slowly, smoothing the wet fabric of my dress. I looked Evan dead in the eye, then shifted my gaze to Madison, who looked smugly satisfied. I told them that if I was the problem in their lives, then tonight I would let my attorney solve that problem. I turned and walked away from the table without looking back. I could feel their confusion radiating behind me as I navigated through the tables of staring strangers. My posture was straight, my head high, despite the water still clinging to my hair. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and out into the cool night air of the parking lot. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. As I pulled my phone from my purse, I scrolled past the family contacts until I stopped at a name I had not dialed in years. Raphael Keene. Attorney. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the ringtone mix with the muffled jazz music coming from inside the restaurant. The line clicked open. A deep, familiar voice spoke my name, asking if it was finally time. I took a breath. The first steady breath I had taken all night. I told him yes. This time it was really happening. Sitting in my car with the engine running, waiting for the heater to chase away the chill of the ice water that had soaked my collar. I let my mind drift back to where this all began. It is funny how a single moment of humiliation can force you to replay your entire life, searching for the exact second you let yourself become a doormat. I was not born into silk sheets and silver spoons. I grew up on the outskirts of a dusty town in Missouri, the daughter of a man who smelled perpetually of sawdust and a mother whose hands were raw from scrubbing other people's floors. I carried the shame of my background like a heavy coat I could never quite take off, always afraid someone would see the poor girl beneath the teacher's blouse. When I met Daniel Ridgway, he did not see the poverty. He saw me. Daniel was a simple man, an electrician who worked 60 hours a week and came home with grease under his fingernails and a smile that could light up a city block. We scraped and saved for 15 years to buy our small house in Denver. We skipped vacations, ate leftovers, and mended our own clothes so that every extra dollar could go into the walls that sheltered us. It was not a mansion, but it was ours, paid for, with sweat and sore backs. I remembered the long nights at the Westfield Alliance Learning Center. I spent 20 years there, teaching adult literacy classes and English as a second language to tired immigrants and factory workers. I took every overtime shift available. I graded papers until my eyes burned. All so Evan could attend a university that cost more in one semester than my father made in 5 years. I wanted him to have the choices I never had. Then came the Tuesday afternoon that changed everything. Daniel had a stroke at work and was gone before the ambulance even reached the hospital. I was left with a mortgage that was almost paid off, a mountain of medical bills, and a silence in the house so loud it made my ears ring. I felt like a carton of milk past its expiration date, useful to no one, just taking up space on the shelf. Evan was my only tether to the world. He was brilliant, handsome, and rising fast in the financial sector. When he was headhunted to become a director at Crossline Developments, a massive real estate firm owned by the family of Vivian Cross, I burst with pride. I thought my sacrifices had finally bloomed. That was when Madison appeared. She was beautiful in a polished, expensive way, like a diamond that had never touched dirt. In the beginning, she was terrifyingly sweet. She called me Mom from the second time we met, bringing me scented candles and scarves that looked pretty but felt cheap to the touch. I wanted so badly to believe it was real. I wanted a daughter, but the mask slipped in inches. It started with the photos. I came over for dinner one Sunday to find that my wedding photo with Daniel, which had always sat on the mantelpiece, had been moved to a drawer. In its place was a professional shot of Evan and Madison in Paris. When I asked, Madison just laughed and said it fit the aesthetic of the room better. Then came the comments about my house. She would run a finger along the doorframe and sigh, suggesting that perhaps a condo would be safer for someone of my age. She told me I did not need so much space, that the maintenance must be overwhelming, that I should sell it and use the equity to enjoy my twilight years in a smaller box. I brushed it off, thinking she was just concerned. I was so blind. I remembered the day Evan came to me with a stack of papers, his face grave but hopeful. He told me the bank needed a co-signer with a long, stable credit history for their new home, just a formality to get a better interest rate. He said it was a bridge loan, something temporary. I saw the logo for Crossline Developments on the header. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised to be honest and kind, and I signed where he pointed. I did not read the fine print. I did not ask why my house deed was referenced in the appendix. I just wanted to be useful again. That was my greatest sin. I wanted to matter. As I sat in the dark parking lot, a specific memory clawed its way to the surface. It was of Raphael Keene. Decades ago, he had been a troubled kid in my night class at Westfield, a boy with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue who everyone else had written off. I stayed late with him, helping him prepare for his GED, telling him he was worth something. Years later, he found me. He had become a tiger in the courtroom, a lawyer people feared. He handed me his card one afternoon and told me that if I ever needed to have legal eyes on anything, I should call him. He owed me. He said. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had graded papers and scrubbed dishes. I should have called Raphael the day Evan brought me those papers. I should have let a shark look at the water before I jumped in. But I didn't, because I thought mothers did not need protection from their sons. I thought love was a currency that never devalued. Tonight, with the phantom sensation of ice water still stinging my skin, I finally realized how wrong I had been. I had spent a lifetime sacrificing for family, only to realize I was just an asset to be liquidated. The incident at the Copper Lantern was not a sudden thunderstorm out of a clear blue sky. It was the final crack in a dam that had been weakening for years, chipped away by 1,000 tiny, deliberate hammer blows. As I drove away from the restaurant, the silence in my car felt heavy with the ghosts of all the small humiliations I had swallowed to keep the peace. It started at the dinner parties. In the beginning, I sat near Evan, but slowly, over the course of 2 years, my place card migrated. I found myself seated at the far end of the table, usually next to a distant cousin or a deaf aunt, far removed from the power center where Vivian, Madison, and Evan held court. I remember one evening specifically when I started to tell a story about how Daniel and I used to fix our own plumbing to save money. Evan had reached over, squeezed my forearm a little too hard, and whispered that I should not discuss poverty in front of his new investors. He said it made the family look unstable, I closed my mouth then, and I suppose I never really opened it again. Then there was the management of my appearance. Madison stopped giving me gifts and started sending me hyperlinks. She would email me links to department store sales for beige cardigans and shapeless slacks, accompanied by messages that read less like suggestions and more like employee dress code violations. She would say that these items were affordable and would help me look presentable without trying too hard. She was dressing me in a uniform of invisibility, ensuring that I faded into the beige wallpaper of their glittering lives. Even the way Evan spoke to me changed. The long Sunday phone calls where we discussed his week and my garden evaporated. They were replaced by sporadic text messages that felt like tasks on a checklist. He would ask if I needed anything, but the tone was transactional, like a landlord checking on a tenant. He was fulfilling a duty, nothing more. The turning point, the moment my heart truly broke, happened 3 months ago. I had baked an apple pie, Evan's favourite, and drove over to their house as a surprise. The front door was unlocked, so I stepped into the foyer. I heard Madison laughing in the living room. She was on a video call with a friend. I froze when I heard my name. She told her friend that dealing with her mother-in-law was like managing a corporate social responsibility project. She said helping me was something they had to do for appearances, but they could not let me damage the brand. I stood there, clutching the warm pie dish, feeling the blood drain from my face. A CSR project. That was what I was to them. Not a mother, not a human being, but a charity case to be managed for public relations. I did not storm in. I did not scream. I turned around and walked out the door, drove home, and sat at my small kitchen table. I watched the steam rise from the pie and fade away until the pastry was stone cold. I threw it in the trash that night. Shortly after that, the campaign to move me began. Vivian and Madison started bringing up Eden Vale Residences, a high-end nursing home that they described as a resort. They did not say they wanted me out of my house. They said I needed professional care. They said the stairs were too dangerous. Then Evan came to me with a pitch that sounded rehearsed. He used words like asset optimization and equity leverage. He told me that selling my house and moving to Eden Vale was a smart investment strategy. But beneath the business jargon, I heard the truth: they wanted the capital locked in the home Daniel had built with his bare hands. That suspicion led me to the filing cabinet in my bedroom. I started pulling out the old mortgage papers and the documents I had signed for Evan's house. I sat on the floor surrounded by paper, and a cold dread filled my stomach. My signature was on documents I did not remember reading. There were loan modifications and rider agreements connected to cross-line developments. I saw clauses that tied my little house to their massive commercial debts. I thought of Daniel. My husband would verify every line of a $10 repair bill. He was cautious because he knew how hard we worked for every cent. I had failed him. I had let my blind trust in our son expose the one thing Daniel had left me. The guilt was a physical weight in my chest, heavier than the water Madison had thrown at me. So, when the ice water hit my face tonight, it was not a shock. It was just the physical manifestation of what they had been doing to me for years. They had been drowning me in inches, erasing me bit by bit. The water did not break me. It woke me up. I realized that the son I loved was gone, replaced by a man who saw his mother as collateral. And collateral does not have feelings, but it does have a breaking point. The house was quiet when I returned, a stark contrast to the clinking silverware and hushed insults of the restaurant. I stood in the center of my small kitchen, the fluorescent light humming above me. My hair was stiff and sticky where the water had dried, and my blouse clung damply to my skin. I stared at the stainless steel sink, watching a single drop of water leak from the faucet and splash against the metal. It was a rhythm I had heard 1,000 times, but tonight it sounded like a countdown. Evan's voice echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of the empty house. "You are causing problems." He had screamed it with such conviction, as if my desire for dignity was a direct assault on his life. I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. I spoke aloud to the empty room, my voice raspy but steady. I said that if protecting myself was considered causing problems, then tonight I would cause problems for everyone. I walked over to the oak cabinet in the hallway, the one where I kept the holiday napkins and the junk mail. Buried in the back, under a stack of old calendars, was a thick accordion folder. I had avoided looking at it for years because it felt like a betrayal to check up on my son. I pulled it out and dumped the contents onto the kitchen table. Papers slid across the laminate surface, mortgage agreements, bank statements, and photocopies bearing the sharp, angular logo of Crossline Developments. I sat down and turned on my reading lamp. I began to read, not as a mother trusting her child, but as the school teacher I used to be, grading a paper for errors. What I found made my breath catch in my throat. I picked up a document titled Deed of Trust. I had assumed I was a co-signer on Evan and Madison's sprawling colonial house, just a name to bolster their credit score. But as I read the legal description, the truth sat there in black and white. The house was not theirs. It was mine. The property at 4502 Oakwood Drive was solely in the name of Eleanor Ridgway. There was a secondary document, a lease agreement internal to Crossline Developments, renting the property back to Evan for a nominal fee of $1 a year. They were using my name to hold the asset, likely to keep it off Evan's personal liability sheets or to dodge taxes. My hands trembled as I reached for another sheet. It was a power of attorney document I vaguely remembered signing 3 years ago when Evan told me it was for medical emergencies. I read the clauses now. It was not limited to healthcare. It granted the attorney-in-fact the right to use assets in the name of Eleanor Ridgway as collateral for strategic commercial loans. I sat back, the room spinning slightly. They were not just waiting for me to die to get my money. They were actively using my credit, my name, and my life savings to underwrite their corporate gambling. If I revoked this power, if I demanded a restructuring of the ownership, the foundation of their financial house of cards would not just shake. It would collapse. I looked at the clock. It was late, but I did not care. I picked up my phone and dialed Raphael Keene again. He answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him about the water. I told him exactly what Evan had screamed at me. And then I read him the clause about the strategic loans and the deed to the house on Oakwood Drive. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the scratch of a pen on paper. When Raphael finally spoke, his voice was devoid of the warmth he had shown earlier. It was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly professional. He told me to keep every single piece of paper that had my signature on it. He told me that tomorrow morning we would review every page, and then he gave me a direct order. He said, "Eleanor, from this moment on, do not sign anything, not a birthday card, not a check, and certainly not anything Evan puts in front of you." I felt a pang of the old maternal guilt, a reflex I could not quite kill. I asked him, my voice shaking, if my son was going to get in trouble. Raphael did not lie to me. He said it was possible. But he told me that I did not create this trouble. He said the trouble was already there, and all we were doing was shining a light on what they had been doing in the dark. I hung up the phone. The fear was still there, but it was different now. It was the fear of a soldier before a battle, not a victim before a beating. I gathered the papers and stacked them neatly. Then I pulled a small spiral notebook from my purse. I sat there for a moment, pen hovering over the paper. I wrote a single sentence. The first day I stopped apologizing for existing. The lobby of Keane and Holloway LLP smelled of expensive coffee and intimidation. It was a fortress of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, a place where the floors were so polished I could see the scuff marks on my sensible shoes reflected back at me. I sat on a leather sofa that probably cost more than my car, clutching my purse to my chest. Men and women in sharp suits breezed past, talking into earpieces about mergers and acquisitions, while I tried to shrink into the cushions. I felt like an imposter, a retired teacher who had wandered into a shark tank. Then the double doors opened, and Raphael Keane walked out. He was 42 now, broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed in charcoal wool, a far cry from the skinny teenager who used to fall asleep in the back of my night class. He spotted me instantly. He did not send an assistant. He came himself. He walked straight to me, extended both hands, and called me Ms. Ridgway. He used the same tone of respectful deference he had used 40 years ago when asking for an extension on a paper. That simple gesture, that acknowledgement of who I used to be before I became just Evan's embarrassing mother, made my throat tight. We moved to a conference room with a view of the city skyline. Raphael and a young female associate spread my documents across a mahogany table that was long enough to land a plane on. They went to work with yellow highlighters, turning my confusing stack of papers into a roadmap of betrayal. Raphael did not use jargon. He spoke to me plainly, translating the legalese into the language of theft. He pointed to a stack of documents related to a project called Aurora Summit Plaza. I had never heard of it. Raphael explained that it was a massive commercial complex Crossline Developments was building. He showed me where my assets, my home, my savings, and the house Evan lived in were listed not just as backup collateral, but as primary guarantees for the high-risk construction loans. Then he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a photocopy of an internal email chain from Crossline. Raphael told me his team had obtained it legally through a discovery process in a separate, unrelated minor dispute involving Crossline vendors. The email was from Vivian Cross to her chief financial officer. The highlighted sentence read, "Her name is a gift from God for our debt ratios. She is low risk, high asset, and asks 0 questions." I stared at the words. A gift from God. That was what Vivian called me. Not because she liked me, but because my spotless credit and my naivety allowed them to borrow millions of dollars to build their empire. Raphael sat back and folded his hands. He explained that what they were doing bordered on elder financial abuse. Because of the vague wording in the power of attorney I had signed, they were technically within the grey area of the law, but only just. However, I held the kill switch. He told me I had the absolute right to revoke the power of attorney immediately. I could demand a full accounting and a restructuring of the property titles. For a moment, the room spun. All this time, Madison and Vivian had treated me like a leech, a burden they had to tolerate. They had made me feel small and useless. But the truth was the opposite. I was not the burden. I was the foundation. Without my name on those papers, their loans would trigger a default clause. I was the linchpin holding their sky-high ambitions together. Raphael leaned forward, his dark eyes serious. He laid out a two-step strategy. First, we would send a formal letter revoking all authorizations effective immediately. Second, we would demand a sit-down meeting to renegotiate the ownership of the properties. He told me that if they refused, we would file a report with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Then he dropped the final piece of information. He told me that Crossline Developments was currently in the middle of a Series B fundraising round. They were trying to court external investors for $50 million. To get that money, their books had to be spotless. If a scandal broke out now involving the exploitation of a senior citizen, specifically the mother of one of their directors, it would not just be embarrassing, it would be fatal to the deal. The silence in the room was heavy. I looked out the window at the city Daniel and I had lived in our whole lives. I thought about how hard Daniel had worked to pay off our mortgage, how he checked the locks every night to keep us safe. They had taken his safety and turned it into a gambling chip. I looked back at Raphael. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, steady resolve. I told him to proceed. I told him to do everything exactly according to the law, and to do it for Daniel. It was the first time since my husband died that I felt I was truly honoring his memory. I was done being their gift from God. I was about to become their act of God. The courier envelope bearing the seal of Keane and Holloway left the office on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone, which had been silent for weeks, began to ring with the violence of a fire alarm. Raphael had warned me this would happen. He told me that the moment the letter landed on Vivian Cross's mahogany desk, the shockwave would travel instantly down to my son. I did not witness Vivian's explosion firsthand, but I could hear the shrapnel in Evan's voice when I finally picked up. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was. He sounded breathless, frantic, like a man trying to hold back a flood with his bare hands. He told me I had lost my mind. He asked how I could do this to them, how I could unleash a pack of lawyers on my own flesh and blood over a misunderstanding. He used the word family like a weapon, swinging it clumsily to bludgeon me back into submission. He promised that if I just called Raphael off, if I just withdrew the letter, he would smooth everything out internally. He said I was making a mountain out of a molehill. A week ago, his panic would have made me crumble. I would have apologized for causing him stress. But today, I stood in my living room, looking at the empty space on the wall where my wedding photo used to hang before Madison moved it, and I felt nothing but a cool detachment. I waited for him to stop gasping for air, and then I spoke. I did not raise my voice. I told him that I was simply reclaiming what was mine. I told him that he was free to hate me, but he was no longer free to assume I was blind to his theft. The silence on the other end was terrified. I hung up before he could start begging. Then came the messages from Madison. My phone vibrated against the kitchen counter every 30 seconds for an hour. It was a stream of consciousness, fueled by rage and fear. She switched tactics with dizzying speed. One message was a plea, claiming she just wanted us to be close again. The next was a threat, screaming that Evan's career would be incinerated if I continued to be so stubborn. She accused me of being jealous, of being bitter, of trying to destroy the family because I was lonely. She said I was ruining everything they had built. I sat there and read them all, feeling like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. I typed out the response Raphael had made me practice. It was a single sentence, devoid of emotion or motherly affection. I wrote, "All legal correspondence regarding this matter must be directed to my attorney, Raphael Keene." I hit send and turned the phone over. The silence that followed was not peace, but it was power. 2 days later, Raphael called me with an update. The pressure was working. Crossline Developments was stuck in a vice. On one side, their bank required absolute legal certainty regarding their collateral assets to finalize the new funding. On the other side, Raphael's letter had effectively frozen those assets. They could not move forward without my cooperation, and they could not bully me into cooperating anymore. Vivian Cross, the woman who had sneered at my dress and called me a gift from God for her debt ratios, had been forced to swallow her pride. She had agreed to a formal meeting to prepare for this confrontation. Raphael introduced me to a friend of his, a forensic accountant named Sarah, who specialized in elder financial security. We sat in a quiet office, and Sarah explained the mechanics of what had been done to me. She showed me charts and figures, explaining how my creditworthiness had been the bedrock for loans that benefited everyone but me. She told me that this was not uncommon. She said that financial abuse often looks like love until you look at the ledger. Listening to her, my perspective shifted. This was no longer just about a glass of water in a restaurant or a rude daughter-in-law. This was about a systemic assumption that old people are resources to be mined rather than people to be respected. If I stayed silent, if I let Evan talk me down, I would be agreeing with the world that I did not matter. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The guilt was still there, a dull ache in my chest. I asked myself if I was destroying my son's future. Was I the villain in his story? But then I thought about the man Evan had become. A man who could watch his wife humiliate his mother and do nothing. I realized I was not ruining his future. I was giving him the only thing I had left to give, which was a lesson in consequences. He had spent his adult life protected by my silence. Now, he would have to learn to stand in the noise. The conference room at Keene and Holloway was a battlefield disguised as a sanctuary of glass and polished wood. On one side of the table sat Raphael and I. On the other sat the Crossline Developments delegation Vivian Cross, looking like a queen whose court was rebelling. A sharp-suited corporate attorney who typed furiously on a laptop. Madison, who refused to make eye contact with me. And Evan. My son sat in the middle, his face a pale shade of green, looking less like a director of a company and more like a child waiting for the principal. Vivian fired the first shot. She did not yell. Instead, she adopted a tone of sickeningly sweet condescension, the kind one uses for a toddler or a very old dog. She leaned forward, clasping her hands, and directed her speech to Raphael, ignoring me entirely. She claimed that this whole situation was a regrettable misunderstanding caused by my confusion. She said that at my age, legal documents can be overwhelming, and that I likely did not understand what I was signing back then. She insisted that everything they did was for my benefit, to manage my assets when I was clearly unable to do so myself. Raphael did not blink. He waited for her to finish, then calmly opened a black binder. He did not argue with her opinions. He simply laid out facts. He pointed to the ambiguous clauses in the power of attorney. He pointed to the internal loan structures that placed 100% of the risk on me and 100% of the profit on them. Then, he pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed email. He slid it across the table so it rested directly in front of Evan. It was an email from Madison to the finance department at Crossline, dated 2 years ago. Raphael read the highlighted section aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. The email read that if they needed the signature quickly, they could just apply a little emotional pressure because I would sign anything. It said that I was terrified of being left alone. I looked at the paper. I read the words my daughter-in-law had written about me. She had taken my deepest vulnerability, the hollow ache of widowhood that I lived with every day, and she had weaponized it. She had turned my loneliness into a business strategy. A few weeks ago, reading that would have made me weep, I would have felt betrayed. But sitting there in that cold room, I felt the last tether of maternal guilt snap. The tears did not come. Instead, a strange, icy clarity settled over me. I looked at Madison, who was staring fixedly at her manicured fingernails, and I felt absolutely nothing. Raphael let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then he laid out our terms. They were non-negotiable. Crossline had to immediately cease using any asset in my name as collateral. The deed to the house on Oakwood Drive, where Evan and Madison slept, had to be transferred back to my sole ownership. They would pay all legal fees. And finally, they would establish and fund a non-profit organization called the Ridgeway Senior Dignity Fund, dedicated to helping elderly victims of financial fraud. Vivian slammed her hand on the table. The mask of sweetness vanished. She hissed that this was extortion. She threatened to countersue us for defamation and breach of contract. She said she would bury me in legal fees until I lost my own house. Raphael smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He leaned back in his chair and told her to go ahead and sue. He said he would be delighted to explain to the press, and specifically to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, exactly how Crossline Developments operated. He asked her how their new investors would react to a headline about a company that tricked widows into funding their skyscrapers. I watched Evan. I saw the realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked from the email on the table to his mother-in-law's red face, and then to me. He realized that if this went public, it would not just be a business problem, it would be the end of him. His reputation in the city would be shredded. For the first time, he understood that the leverage had shifted. The quiet mother he had ignored was now holding the detonator to his entire life. Madison suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling. She looked at me with wide, wet eyes, trying to pivot back to the personal angle. She asked why I could not have just spoken to them privately. She asked why I had to make such a big production out of this when we were family. I looked her dead in the eye. My voice was steady, stronger than it had been in years. I told her that they were the ones who made it a big production the moment they used my name to borrow millions of dollars. The meeting ended without handshakes. The Crossline team packed up their briefcases in tense silence. As they walked out, Vivian glared at me with pure hatred, but she did not say a word. She knew she had lost. Evan lingered for a second at the door, looking like he wanted to say something. Perhaps an apology, perhaps an excuse. But I turned my chair to face the window, watching the city below, and let him walk out into the hallway alone. Information travels fast in a city like Denver, especially when it involves money and scandal. Even though our meeting at the law firm had been behind closed doors, the walls of the financial district are thin. Within 48 hours, whispers began to circulate through the country clubs and boardrooms. People were not talking about Crossline's new skyscraper. They were talking about a certain prominent family that had built their leverage on the back of a 60-year-old widow. The word predatory was thrown around. Questions about company culture began to rise like smoke from a hidden fire. Raphael told me that a financial journalist from a local magazine had contacted him. She wanted an anonymous comment on a story she was developing about elder abuse in high-net-worth real estate. Raphael, being the shark that he is, refused to give specific details about my case. But he gave her a quote that was far more damaging. He told her that what happened to his client was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a rot in the system. That quote ran in the online edition the next morning. The pressure on Crossline became tangible. Raphael learned through his network that the minority shareholders were panicked. They were terrified that this story would spook the new investors for the Series B funding round. They demanded that the board clean up any potential scandals immediately. Vivian Cross, who was used to bulldozing her way through problems, suddenly found herself cornered by the very money she worshipped. Evan was caught in the middle of the crushing gears. He stopped texting me, demanding I fix things. Instead, I heard through Raphael that the board was looking at him as a liability. They told him to manage his mother, but he could not. For the first time in his life, Evan was realizing that his silence over the years had not brought him security. He had closed his eyes to their greed because he was afraid of losing his seat at the table. But now, that very seat was sliding out from under him. One evening, I opened my email to find a message from an unfamiliar address. The subject line was blank. The body of the email was short. It was from a junior employee at Crossline, writing anonymously. They told me that everyone in the office was talking about the letter. They thanked me for doing the one thing many of them wished they were brave enough to do. They said the culture of the company was built on bullying, and watching someone finally stand up to Vivian Cross was the most inspiring thing they had seen in years. I read that email 3 times, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. I was not just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had been made to feel small by people like them. Raphael decided to press our advantage. He contacted Crossline's legal team with a final ultimatum. If they did not sign the settlement agreement within 24 hours, we would file a formal complaint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We would attach every document, every email, and every text message. It would be a regulatory nightmare and a public relations catastrophe that no amount of spin could fix. Vivian blinked. She called an emergency meeting with her lawyers and the executive board. She agreed to sign the agreement, but she had one condition. She wanted to control the narrative. She did not want to admit to fraud. Instead, she proposed turning the settlement into a public relations campaign. She wanted to frame the return of my property and the creation of the fund as a corporate social responsibility initiative. She wanted to act as if they had discovered a gap in their compliance and were benevolently fixing it. Part of the settlement included a mandatory public event. Crossline would host a press conference to announce the launch of the Ridgeway Senior Dignity Fund. They would publicly admit that there had been lapses in transparency regarding elderly clients, and they would pledge to do better. When I first heard this, panic clawed at my throat. I told Raphael I did not want to be paraded in front of cameras. I was afraid they would make me look foolish. But Raphael shook his head. He told me to look at it differently. He said this was not them honoring me. This was them being forced to kneel. They had to stand on a stage and publicly pay for the sins they tried to hide. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror. I looked at the lines on my face, the grey in my hair. For so long, those features had felt like signs of my expiration. Now, they looked like battle scars. I practiced saying the name out loud. Ridgeway Senior Dignity Fund. It rolled off my tongue. Solid and heavy. My name would no longer be associated with a burden or a debt ratio. It would stand for dignity. For the first time in years, I recognized the woman staring back at me. She was not just a mother or a widow. She was Eleanor Ridgway, and she was done being invisible. The Aurora Ridge Convention Hall was a cavern of glass and steel, the kind of place designed to make human beings feel insignificant. Crossline developments usually reserved this venue to unveil billion-dollar skyscrapers or announce hostile takeovers. But tonight, the massive projection screens flanking the stage displayed something different. Next to the sharp, aggressive logo of Crossline sat a new emblem, soft and dignified, the Ridgway Senior Dignity Fund. Seeing my name, and by extension, Daniel's name, projected 10 feet high in that room felt surreal. It was a victory, but it was a victory that tasted like cold iron. I wore a simple black dress that I had owned for a decade, paired with a silk scarf that Daniel had bought me for our 25th anniversary. I touched the fabric at my neck, feeling a phantom connection to him. Raphael stood beside me, looking less like a lawyer and more like a bodyguard. He was the wall between me and the sharks in the room. In the front row, just a few feet away, sat Evan and Madison. They looked smaller than I had ever seen them. They stared rigidly at the empty stage, refusing to turn their heads in my direction, as if looking at me would turn them to stone. The master of ceremonies, a slick man with a radio voice, introduced Vivian Cross. The applause was polite, but thin. Vivian walked to the podium with the stiffness of a woman marching to the gallows. She was dressed in white, trying to project innocence, but her jaw was set tight. She began to read from the teleprompter, her voice lacking its usual imperious cadence. She stuck strictly to the legal script Raphael had forced down her throat. She admitted that Crossline Developments had identified regrettable shortcomings in how they explained complex financial terms to their elderly clients. She spoke of a renewed commitment to transparency, but the words sounded mechanical, stripped of any genuine remorse. Then came the moment that twisted the knife. As per the agreement, Vivian had to acknowledge us. She paused, swallowed visibly, and said that the company wished to thank Daniel and Eleanor Ridgway for their courage in coming forward to help Crossline correct its course. Hearing Daniel's name echo through that expensive hall made my breath catch. For years, these people had treated my husband's memory as nothing more than a ghost haunting a house they wanted to sell. Now, they were forced to speak his name with respect. It hurt. But it also felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. A representative from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau spoke next. He did not use soft words. He spoke about the epidemic of financial elder abuse and the predatory nature of using family assets for corporate gain. He did not explicitly threaten Crossline, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. He was letting every investor in the room know that the federal government was watching this company very closely. Then, it was my turn. The MC invited me up to receive a commemorative bouquet of flowers. The walk to the podium felt miles long. I accepted the flowers, heavy and smelling of lilies. But I did not smile. I did not offer the forgiveness they were desperate for. I leaned into the microphone and looked out at the sea of suits. I said simply that I did not want anyone else to ever sign a piece of paper they did not understand, just because they were afraid of being a burden to their children. The silence that followed was absolute. The cameras flashed, blinding white bursts of light, but the room was deadly quiet. I looked down at the front row. Evan looked up at me. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a mixture of shame and a strange, terrified respect. He was looking at me not as his mother, but as a force of nature he had foolishly underestimated. I saw Madison lean in close to him, her hand gripping his arm until her knuckles were white. I could read her lips as she whispered that she did not think things would go this far. I saw Evan pull his arm away from her. He whispered back that things had gone this far the moment they decided to use my name to secure their loan. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to mingle, a group of older men and women approached me. They were not investors. They were ordinary people who had slipped in at the back. One woman took my hand and told me she had lost her savings to a nephew she trusted. Another man told me about a reverse mortgage he did not understand. They thanked me, standing there, listening to their stories. I realized that the Ridgeway Senior Dignity Fund was not just a legal penalty for Crossline. It was real. My fight had started as a way to save my own house, but it had become a shield for people who had no one else to defend them. 3 days after the press conference, a knock sounded on my front door. It was not the aggressive pounding of a courier or the polite tap of a neighbor. It was hesitant. When I opened the door, I found Evan standing on the porch. He was alone. There was no company car in the driveway, no Madison hovering over his shoulder, and for the first time in years, he was not wearing a suit. He stood there in a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, looking like the tired man he actually was, rather than the executive he pretended to be. He was standing in front of the very threshold he had tried to force me to leave just weeks ago. We sat in the living room, the silence thick between us. Evan did not try to spin a narrative this time. He looked at his hands and confessed. He told me that he had seen the ambiguous clauses in the loan documents years ago. He admitted that he knew his wife's family was leveraging my assets to secure their empire. He said he told himself that everyone did business that way, that it was standard practice. But then he looked up at me, his eyes red, and admitted the uglier truth. He had chosen not to look too closely because he was terrified that if he asked questions, he would lose his chance at a promotion. I listened to him, feeling a deep, aching sadness. But I did not reach out to hold him. I did not offer him the easy comfort of a mother's excuse. I simply told him that he had chosen silence when they needed my name, and now he had to live with the consequences of that silence. Evan began to cry. It was not a loud, theatrical display, but the quiet, shaking sobs of a man who had been carrying a weight he was not strong enough to bear. He asked me for a chance to prove that he could be different, even if it meant leaving Crossline Developments and starting over. I did not tell him I forgave him. Forgiveness is cheap. Trust is expensive. I gave him 2 conditions. First, he had to hire an independent attorney, one with no ties to the Cross family, to audit his own finances and separate his life from theirs. Second, in any future family gathering, I would never again be seated in the corner or treated as an obligation. I told him I would sit at the head of the table, or I would not sit at all. Later that week, I received a long email from Madison. It was not a sincere apology, but it was an honest one. She wrote about the crushing pressure of maintaining the Cross family image, about how she had been raised to view people as assets or liabilities. She admitted she had used me as a buffer because she thought I was too weak to ever leave. I replied with a single paragraph. I told her that I did not hate her. I told her that I hated the way she treated her own fear by throwing it at others. I wrote that if she truly wanted to change, she should start by respecting the people she did not need anything from. Legally, the war ended quietly. The deed to the house on Oakwood Drive was transferred back to my name. The power of attorney was shredded. The Ridgeway Senior Dignity Fund began its operations with me, serving as an honorary advisor. One rainy afternoon, I sat in the new community room of the fund's headquarters. I was speaking to a group of 20 seniors, teaching them how to spot red flags in loan agreements. Raphael was setting up a projector in the back, nodding at me with a proud smile. A shaft of light caught my reflection in the glass door, illuminating my grey hair. For the first time, I did not see it as a sign of fading away. I saw it as a silver crown. When I walked outside, the sky had opened up. Standing on the sidewalk, soaked to the hem of his jeans, was Evan. He held a large umbrella. As I approached, he did not say that everything was fixed. He simply held the umbrella over my head and handed me a travel mug. It was filled with warm tea. I took the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my cold hands. It was a small gesture, but it was the opposite of the ice water that had started this entire journey. I looked at my son and told him that from now on, if there was a problem, we would solve it with the truth, not by throwing water at each other. I stepped out into the rain under the shelter he provided, knowing that I was no longer sitting in the back row of anyone's life. I had finally taken my seat in the front row of my own. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I would love to hear where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit the like button, and smash that hype button to help this video reach even more people.